All right, welcome Dartmouth Libertarians members. Today we will be going over the excerpt of about 20 to 30 pages that we read from Frederic Bastiat's The Law, and presented by yours truly, Jonathan Nicastro. So some of the first things that Bastiat explains in the opening remarks of the law is where life and kind of human worth and rights come from. And it's not from government, hint. So on page 1, he expounds that life, liberty, and property, these are negative natural rights, do not exist because men have made laws. And he goes on the second page to say that each of us has a natural right from God, he deliberately specifies, to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. So I think that these two quotes are really important because they lay the groundwork, which was not originated by Bastiat, but by earlier philosophers. You know, the whole life, liberty, property phrase, and that, you know, individuals have a right to that, that's John Locke and, you know, potentially earlier philosophers, but he's the one who really popularized it. And Bastiat clearly is in agreement. And furthermore, he specifies that these aren't things that are just created by law, but they're perhaps recognized by law, and they come from God. So there you go. Important to remember as we move forward. So moving on, since humans as individuals have a right to defend their life, liberty, and property, and this right, Bastiat, as he said earlier, is from God, government acting as a kind of corporate assembly of all the individuals in a society has, as Bastiat puts it, the proper functions of the law cannot lawfully extend beyond the proper functions of force. So basically, since men are sanctioned by God, in Bastiat's view, other libertarian philosophers would say it's natural or it's innate, because not all libertarianism is predicated on theology, and certainly not by any specific theology. Right, so Bastiat says they're sanctioned to defend their negative rights, the life, liberty, and property that we talked about earlier, and the government is similarly justified in collectively defending people's individual rights. So, for example, if I had a gun, I could probably effectively preserve my life, my liberty, and my property. But just because another citizen of the society isn't able to do that because they're not mighty enough or they don't have their own strength, it's still legitimate for the government to step in with its police powers and defend their life, their liberty, and their property. And I don't think any of us would disagree with that. So moving on. So sadly, the law and the state and its police powers really do not, in our day and age, or even in Bastiat's age when he was writing, which is the early 19th century in France, the law and the government did not really exist to defend people's individual lives, liberty, and property. And here are some quotes about how the law has been perverted from Bastiat's perspective in his time and geographical context. So on page 20, he says, "Nothing can enter the public treasury for the benefit of one citizen or one class unless other citizens and other classes have been forced to send it in." And the italics are my own, but the word forced isn't my own. That's the word that Bastiat used. And I think that the forced part is important to remember when some people advocate, just as some of his more socialist contemporaries did at the time, that sure, they believe in liberty, you know, they believe in natural rights, but they also believe in the public provision of goods and services. But the government doesn't have things to provide unless it takes from one to give to another. Hence, Bastiat here makes explicitly clear that people have to be forced to provide these things, even if they're legitimate things and they're not, you know, wanton, wasteful things, but the government wants to provide, I don't know, something to help certain citizens subsist or just like simply to live. That's fine and dandy unless you force that wealth, those goods, those services from one to give it to another, because then you have coercion, and that's a violation of the negative rights of life, liberty, and property, necessarily. So furthermore, on page 4, Bastiat says, it directly follows that, that's my paraphrasing. So it directly follows from our other quote that the law has been used to destroy its own objective. It has been applied to annihilating the justice that it was supposed to maintain, to limiting and destroying rights, which its real purpose was to respect. And that's basically just putting in a much more succinct and better way what I was trying to express when I italicized the word forced. Moving on. Bastiat talks a lot about plunder, both illegal and legal, and I'm just going to briefly define what both of those things are. So illegal plunder is just a fancy way for Bastiat to say theft, and that's a concept we're all very familiar with, and that is the coercive, non-consensual appropriation of someone else's private property to another party. And legal plunder is like this, except, as Bastiat articulates, how is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. So again, it's this coercive, non-consensual appropriation from one to another, but instead of it being carried out against the law by felons or by criminals or thieves, it's carried out by the government. And so now we're going to get into a little bit of the different forms of legal plunder, because this is not quite so straightforward. So Bastiat did not only consider the coercive redistribution of wealth via taxation as a form of plunder, and this is the one that people think libertarians focus on. You know, all we're against is against transfer payments, and we just don't want to help the poor. Quite wrong, as a matter of fact. And as Bastiat himself articulates, you know, one of the vanguard libertarians, he also regarded protectionist policies, such as tariffs and government-granted monopolies, as a similar form of coercive redistribution of wealth. So, and he puts it plainly on page 18. He says, protectionism, socialism, and communism are basically the same plant in 3 different stages of its growth, with protectionism being its first, and which is something we participate in the United States, socialism being the second, and communism being the last. And Bastiat doesn't only say this once, but again on page 14, he says that socialists, like all other monopolists, desire to make the law their own weapon. And like socialists say in a very straightforward manner, they seek to take from the rich and give to the poor. Monopolists, particularly, let's say, domestic industries, which are favored over foreign industries, and they have tariffs that the government places on those foreign competitors, that doesn't penalize just those foreign competitors. What it does is it's a forcible redistribution of wealth from the consumers of, let's say, France to the French corn growers, the French wheat makers, that would otherwise have bought the cheaper wheat from England. And this is why actually Bastiat was also, a lot of the work he did outside of his writing was part of the British Anti-Corn Law League, which was a big free trade, anti-protectionist cooperative association between France and England. And shortly after Bastiat's death, actually almost all of French laws provided for free global trade. So he was actually very successful post-mortem. All right, moving on. So democracy and legal plunder, because it's worthwhile to explain how the appropriate function of government, that is protecting the negative rights of a populace, was so perverted to subvert these negative rights to provide a redistribution of wealth in the society. And so Bastiat explains it through democracy, which we in the West and in the 21st century just take axiomatically as a good, but I think Bastiat explains very well how that may not be the case. So I'm just going to read directly from him. If law were nothing more than the organized combination of the individual's right to self-defense, if law were the obstacle, the check, the punisher of all oppression and plunder, is it likely that we citizens would then argue much about the extent of franchise? Close quote. That's from page 10. And the answer to which is obviously no. I mean, why would we go out and vote if all we were voting for is the different person who would dutifully defend us from the force of either foreign powers or domestic agents? People wouldn't really be interested. However, he explains that this isn't what the law does. And since this isn't just what the law limits itself to and what the government limits itself to, people are very invested in their franchise and who they vote for. So he says, everyone wants to participate in making the law, either to protect himself against plunder or to use it for plunder. Page 11. A very short sentence, actually just a part of a sentence from the law. But I think that the more you think about how this applies to contemporary American politics, the more it's true. You know, if you're a Democrat, let's say you want to vote for some politician who will pass or Medicare or some other single payer solution. Well, those things are funded through the government mandating that people, the taxpayer, pay into it. Okay, so that's plunder. Whether you think it's for legitimate means or not is another thing, but it is by definition legal plunder. And then if, let's say, you're a right-winger or a Republican and you want government to be smaller, it's because you're tired of getting plundered, perhaps. So now voting is just about either people wanting to plunder more or the people who are getting plundered wanting to be plundered less, which is kind of perverse. But it's not unexpected. And Bastiat explains this on page 5. He says, since man is naturally inclined to avoid pain, and since labor is pain in itself, it follows that men will resort to plunder whenever plunder is easier than work. And here you can see that Bastiat is actually coming at the whole question of man's nature and what man finds pleasing and displeasing from a pseudo-religious and specifically a pseudo-Catholic angle. Labor is pain in itself. That's reminiscent of God, casting man out of Eden and, down to the earth to toil, and he'll only reap what he sows. That's very Christian moral rhetoric, which is just interesting to note. All right. So not only is plunder, let's say, distasteful to those of us, like libertarians and other people who believe in negative rights, because it's just a flagrant violation of them, but it subverts what Bastiat refers to as the law of responsibility elsewhere in the law. And so starting from page 3, he specifies that man possesses all the privileges, which were those negative rights he mentioned, as well as all the responsibilities of his existence. So when their responsibility is robbed from them, on page 19, Bastiat explains that intelligence becomes a useless prop for the people. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, their property. Furthermore, Bastiat contends that, on page 20, the concept of individual responsibility, which God has willed in order that mankind may have the choice between vice and virtue, and the resulting punishment and reward, close quote, is distorted when one is granted goods and services through the plunders of others. So it may sound a little harsh or mean, although I think that I and other libertarians would argue certainly not more mean or negative or otherwise detrimental than the actual use of coercion to violate somebody's negative rights. But if you don't have the party, and it's not always this simple, there are people who can legitimately not provide for themselves. But if we just take a straightforward example, somebody who chooses not to work because it's easier for the state to plunder on their behalf and give them in-kind transfer payments that they didn't earn, then they have no use for, to go back to the quote from page 19, their intelligence. Well, why use your intellect if you can just sit back and have the government plunder for you? And furthermore, that this law of responsibility, right, that you have these negative rights, and with these negative rights to life, liberty, and property comes the responsibility to use those negative rights to sustain yourself and to lead a virtuous and upright life and to benefit from the rewards. But when you undermine the individual responsibility through the state plundering for some, on behalf of some, while plundering from others, this correspondence between vice and punishment and virtue and reward is totally undermined. And that isn't just bad for society or the people getting plundered, but it's particularly bad for the psyches of those who are actually benefiting from the plunder. So the whole plundering is really bad all around. Okay, that's it. Yes, I hope you learned something. That's Bastiat in maybe 10 minutes.